So one of the more interesting aspects about Pokemon are the regions you play in. And as of right now, we have access to 9 main regions and a bunch of other ones. Technically, there's a lot in like the Ranger games and a few others like Conquest. Technically, there's a bunch of different stuff. You can even argue like Snap and Stadium technically have their own region of sorts. Ignoring that, we're going to be focusing on the 9 main regions plus Ore because I really do think it is something to talk about, and it does do better in some areas than even main regions. It does have some limitations being, you know, outside the main games, but we'll talk to it when we get there. I do want to point out that there are 5 here. It's just filler. I couldn't quickly figure out how to make it 4 because to me, there's not enough here to need 5 tiers. So A is the highest. Nothing is going to go into this filler tier, but there you go. We're going to start at the very beginning with Kanto. Now, Kanto, in my opinion, is definitely showing its age whenever you point at it. It doesn't really have an aesthetic, besides maybe back then being technologically advanced versus... It's like a suburb type of feel. Like, you have very centralized areas in Saffron and Celadon, and then it becomes kind of rural as you go to, like, you know, like Fuchsia, where it has like a safari zone, or even like Lavender, where it's much more like respectful graveyard feel. And then you even have like a resort type island in the form of Cinnabar. And while I would love to hate on Kanto, I'm mostly here to point out the kind of route layouts and the way it's like designed, the design philosophy. Because ultimately, I don't really like the fake non-linearity that happens in Kanto. I hate it. But ignoring that, not because it's not a valid thing, but mostly because it shouldn't really impact how I view it for like design philosophy and stuff. I think I'm gonna put it at the very, very bottom. We'll look at it more as we get there, but it's probably gonna be at the bottom of B. Ultimately, I found it, while Kanto is a good baseline, I also think it does have a little bit more character than some of the ones we'll talk about. But let's talk about Johto. Now, Johto, if we were to talk about Johto in 2 separate instances, which I thought about putting in here twice, because Gold, Silver, Crystal Johto is way different than even Heart Gold Soul Silver Johto. Yes, I understand having a little bit more next to Signwood doesn't really change that much in the grand scheme of things, but it brings a lot more character forward. But I am going to be fair and kind of focus more on the originals, but I will be putting in, you know, the addition to my mind because like the Pokethlon didn't exist, and a few other things, of course. But there are some interesting aspects about Johto. It's much more rural and much more like traditional is how I would say it. It definitely has this stylings of kind of technology starting to break through with like the radio tower and stuff. And I do ultimately like the main path you take in Johto. I wish it was done a little better gameplay wise, but the actual like split that happens in Johto feels very, very like fleshed out and nice in comparison to Kanto. The problem lies in, while I do love all the design aesthetics and I do love the locations of it, I do feel that there's not enough like weird dungeons to explore. The problem is that in both games that Johto shows up, whether it's the remakes or the originals, Kanto is always there. And so it can fill in a bunch of slots that Johto just happens to not have. Yes, we have 1 cave, technically we have 2. We have a forest, and we have an ice path, and cool, we have Dark Cave as well. We have a lot of caves. That's Johto. Whereas Kanto, you have like a power plant, you have even like a mansion, which I am including in this. And yeah, you have the Burned Tower, but you have Lavender Tower in Kanto. And you can kind of compare. And also the Victory Road of Johto feels very lackluster. It doesn't feel like a final challenge. Feels like, okay, come on, let's get through this. So I am going to put it at C. Do note that Heart Gold Soul Silver is my favorite game of all now of all time, but of Pokemon in general. So this is coming from someone that loves Heart Gold Soul Silver. Johto is not a great region. Hoenn is next, and then we'll get to Ore. But Hoenn, if we were to talk to my 12-year-old self about what is his favorite region, he would probably put Sinnoh, because that would have been out by then, and he would then probably put Kanto, and then Johto, and then Hoenn last. Well, if we're counting Ore, he'd probably put Ore last, but that's because, ignoring that, I think Hoenn deserves a lot of credit. Not only do you have to split the motif between, land and sea, but there's a lot of interesting locations. A desert was fully added. You have the volcanic ash. You have proper volcanoes fully explored this time. You have diving spots. You have rapid currents. You have all the stuff that is included with water, and more importantly, land that I feel fleshes out these areas a lot more. As time would go on, we'd get different and varied locations as we went into the generations, and Hoenn felt like the biggest step forward. Not to mention, it flows really well. There's only one awkward spot I think exists in Hoenn, and it's right after you beat Norman, when you're supposed to cross the little sea route to then start on your path to Winona. It really is the only stopping point, whereas Johto, you can argue, okay, the split after Morty is kind of a little weird for some people, and Kanto, there's a whole split that happens after Rock Tunnel. What can you do? Or even if you want to argue it, Celadon. There's a lot of stuff you can do, and it really becomes kind of, in my opinion, very annoying. But Hoenn has just the small little split that I think could have been done a little better. But ignoring that, I happen to do think Hoenn is actually one of my favorite regions. This has a lot to do with the motif being followed thoroughly, new areas that I think are interesting to explore for the first time. And while I mentioned a bunch of locations, I do think it has a lot of interesting, and I do think this is very understated, interesting legendary connections. I kind of skipped over it, whereas Johto has like the Burn Tower and stuff and the Whirl Islands, and that's really cool. And Kanto has the power plant, Seafoam Islands, and then sadly Victory Road. We're not counting the Sevi Islands here, that's cheating. But when it comes to Hoenn, you have different landscapes. You have like a desert, and you have a couple of the lakes where you have to do this intricate puzzles for the Regis. Then you, of course, have, the stuff with Groudon, Kyogre, and Rayquaza that ultimately leads into very interesting things. Not to mention the kind of events, the weird events that can happen in Hoenn that I do think brings it up here. It's not necessarily the most brilliant region. We'll talk about those as we go, but I do think it deserves a lot of credit. It splits the motif really well, and that's all I really want. Next, we're going to talk about Ore. It deserves a little credit because this really feels like, at most, a ragtag put together region. It feels so disconnected from each location. Fennec City feels like a wild oasis that happens to exist in this rundown area, and Ore is one of those places where when you bring it up, and to people that have played it, it's definitely something to pay attention to, because Ore has so many locations that I think are very fun. You have the Under, for instance, even if as you go to XD, where you get to Gatian Port and you start getting the islands and all that, you start seeing a lot more of this region, and I feel like it encapsulates this wondrous ragtag, like slowly being built up from these like deep underground into eventually, hopefully, a very bright and surviving ecosystem. It's really interesting that you can feel that with only 2 games, but hey, to be perfectly clear, some of these games only got some of these regions only got 1. Hello, Kalos. Hello, I almost said Unova, which it got 2, Galar, but Ore got 2, and it was enough to flesh it out to the point where I do think it deserves a lot of credit. It's really unfair for me to put it any higher, though, because ultimately this is very separated and it's limited because it's not exactly an explore the whole entire region type of game. So I'm not going to give it that much credit, but I will say the design philosophy feels very nice and it fits for what you're doing. But yeah, it deserves C. If we were to rank it on different stuff, it'd probably go higher, but we're going to be fair. Sinnoh, I happen to think, is one of the best regions in all of history. This comes down to the different environments, from a deep forest that feels much more like spooky, mysterious, haunted mansion, a giant mountain that splits the region into, well, thirds based on the game. The snow area, Sunny Shore being a wild like area. There's a lot of just weird stuff that at first glance doesn't seem too big, but even the towns have character. There's a mine, there's just so much going on. There's Iron Island, there's just a lot in Sinnoh, and I don't want to sit here and keep like harping on these, and I'll start to fade back a little bit because we'll talk about how some of these have a lot of problems, but Sinnoh design philosophy feels like it was a bigger, better Hoenn. And the only thing I will say that it kind of sucks is this path you end up taking in Sinnoh is, for lack of a better term, there's like a backtrack type section that exists, and I do think it's kind of annoying that you do it twice, but it's fine for what it is. I do think Sinnoh is actually really, really good. Unova. Now, if we were to argue on which Unova I think is better, it's actually really hard. I do like the pacing of Black and White. I have a lot of problems with the first Black and White, but the pacing I think is on point. And Black 2 and White 2 I think adds a bunch of areas that I think are interesting and flesh out a lot of Unova. It has just the Verbank complex itself really feels nice. Castelia sewers and so on and so forth. There's a lot of stuff that I think feels nice. But as you get to like the desert and a bunch of other stuff, I do think Unova is, we'll talk about it in a lot of the later entries, but I'm gonna be the guy that says it. I think Unova is probably the best region we've come across. It has, not only does it have environments that are affected by seasons, which is really cool, but it has a varied location that looks brilliant and feels vibrant. There is something to be said about going to Kanto and going from town to town where you can talk to NPCs and they say their one line and they go away. Or you can go into Unova where each and every little town has a different style of NPC that really feels like maybe, just maybe, if this was a little bit more time put into it, you could feel the living space that they take up. And I do think Unova deserves a lot more credit than a lot of people give it. It also starts a theme that we'll talk about here called centralization, which, bad word for it, but it centralizes the region where you have a big center point. I'm kind of highlighting the picture here. And then you have a bunch of stuff on the outside. It kind of creates like a center and then a ring. And we'll run into this several times because, as we talk about next with Kalos, Kalos kind of does this itself. And Kalos has this problem, and this is mostly just because of the pacing of Kalos, where the center itself is really on point. I think the beginning of the game is great. It's a straight line to what is the center, and it feels like the world opens up to you in a massive way. And then the immediate second section, I think, is lame as hell. It is an L. It is a long stretched out L, but it is just a lame L with glittering caves and ocean that I think is really lame. The rest of the region is really on point, but this is why it ultimately is going to be under Kanto, is because while I do think it has a lot more vibrant locations, literally the middle portion of the game, I'll call it, or right after the beginning, whatever you want to call it, chapter 2, I don't give a shit, is the lamest. Is one of the lamest design choices I've ever seen in Pokemon. It really hurts it because there's a lot of cool Pokemon that exist in this game, and there's a lot of cool locations, but Kalos has this problem of not matching the locations to great big moments, and even when it does, they're locked to later or early, so cool. Very frustrating, but let's talk about Alola. We're going to be the guy that says it. We're going to be. I'm plural apparently. I'm gonna be the guy that says it. I think Alola is very underrated. It sets out to do what it wants to do, and that's it. It's a lot like Ore in this fashion where it's very disconnected from other regions. It's not a fully explored type of style, but it's much more of like a location, and I think it does incredibly well. There's a lot of just heart in Alola. It is definitely one where it has been a long time since I fully played Generation 7, and maybe one day I'll go back to and change my opinion of how this region is, but I do think it feels very vibrant, and it has this type of styling that I think carries even past the newer regions or even some of the old ones. There's still some frustrating areas, and I'm never going to get away from the pacing of Alola. Doesn't matter which game, whether it's Ultra or whether it's the original Sun and Moon, it really does. It slows to a crawl in two areas, specifically the beginning of the game, which we all know about that, and towards the end of the game, there is a really bad spot. And while I do love Alola, I do have to point out its negatives here. But yeah, I do think it's up there. Now we're going to talk about Galar. Galar, as a bit of spoilers, is going to be the only F here. Now, Galar has a very interesting concept with the wild area, which is actually something that I have been wishing for in Pokemon. Just in general, it is very, very well done. Just a full area that you can explore with so many species, so many areas that can have different versions. It's so cool. But that's not the whole game. The routes in Galar are miserable. The cities are lame as hell. Even the dungeons, in quote, are very just lame. I don't have another word for Galar besides lame. It does feel like someone tried really hard to make the wild area like go as far as it could, and then just went, oh shit, we have the rest of the game to go. What do we do, man? What do we do? Straight lines everywhere. It is straight line central, and it's weird because if you were to look at the map of Galar, like how it is right now, you wouldn't think that it's a straight line because it looks like maybe there's a centralized area and then there's the south and the north. No, it is actually a straight line after the wild area. It's very, very frustrating. The DLC, I understand, expands upon stuff, but this is just the region itself, and even the DLC ends up becoming just different wild areas in ways. So I find it incredibly disappointing Galar exists as it does, because it has one of the greatest hooks ever in the wild area. Very frustrating. Not to mention the pacing of Galar is lackluster, as the newer generations always do. Now, Paldea, and another thing, ignoring all the graphical issues and blah, 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 blah of Scarlet and Violet, it has a lot of character. It's kind of surprising because we're back to a central type of area again, and then you have the east, southwest, and north. It's been a little bit since I played these, but yeah, it has a very interesting concept. The only problem is that when you go to this type of styling, it loses a lot of identity. This is definitely like one where I can argue whether it's better or worse than Johto, and right now I happen to think it's a little better than Johto. Not too much of a stretch, but it's a little arguable here. I don't necessarily think it's a bad region. I just think everything surrounding it is always the negative talking point, and it happens to be that Paldea could have been just a mediocre to good region, but it's never going to be highlighted by a lot of people that are distracted by the bigger negatives of Scarlet and Violet. That's not to mention, I do think there's a lot of cool areas. I do happen to think the caves, which there are more numerous because it's much more open world focused, do feel very fleshed out. But the general plains do suffer from what I like to call Breath of the Wild syndrome, where it's just empty and doesn't feel nice. There's some really cool areas that I do think the towns themselves are on point. And I do like the kind of almost camping aesthetic that appears in some of the locations. You'll see like, if you see like the Pokemon Center and the Pokemon like outcrops or whatever they're called, I'm forgetting right now. They are kind of like set up in such a way where if you go slightly away from them, they feel like oh, this is like a campground, which I think is really, really neat. But it doesn't really fit that aesthetic all the way through, and so I can't really say it's a great thing. But yeah, that's kind of my tier list. This is why I wanted to stick with 4 tiers, because what am I doing with 5? Putting in Nova and Sinnoh up there, it's just not point. There's no point. And there is an argument to be made that Paldea deserves to be in top of C or even below Johto. I can definitely see that. But as of right now, this is kind of how it sits for me. Unova is my personal favorite region to just look at and play through, whether it's actually go through the main stuff or whatever have you. I personally think it is really fun to just look around and explore locations. It also helps that at the time they filled it with a lot, and I do mean a lot of cool Easter eggs to search out. But yeah, another thing I do want to preface here is that if you like any of these regions, it is perfectly fine. Besides Galar, if you like Galar, you're fucking crazy.